parte sua abbiamo tanti altri amici che non sono riusciti a venire, che ci hanno mandato fiumi di parole, quindi ci siamo presi la libertà di tagliare un pochino e niente, Peter parlerà anche in rappresentanza loro.
Ok, buonasera. Inizierò parlando italiano un po', grazie a Google e anche a Frida. Per la maggior parte di voi, Chris era un amico o un collega. Per Frida era un padre devoto, per Manu era un marito da 25 anni e il suo migliore amico era ancora di più. Allora, tutti abbiamo avuto una parte della vita di Chris. La mia era come mio fratello maggiore, o anche Nigel. Un fratello che è stato disponibile, amichevole, solidale, gentile e competitivo. E così ora parlerò l'inglese. So, for many of you here, Chris was a great friend or a supportive colleague. To Frida, he was a devoted father. To Manu, a beloved husband, 25 years, and her best friend for even longer, forever. So we all shared a piece of Chris's life, and my little piece, and Nigel's, was that he was our big brother. And a big brother is an important thing. A big brother is there from the moment you're born. So he was always there. Chris was the third son of 5 sons, born in the 1950s and 1960s, to Jeff and Audrey Berrie. I'm the 4th son, and Nigel is the 5th. So, as my immediate older brother, Chris went into the adult world just a few years ahead of me, and I struggled with my teenage years, and he was there to help me. Not all brothers would do that. In the late 70s, so I was at boarding school. I don't know if everyone understands boarding school. So it's a school where the pupils live in school accommodation except during holidays. So I spent most of my evenings and my weekends trapped with 30 other teenage boys and a rather restrictive, stifling environment which was very hard to escape from. Chris was also in Cambridge at the time, in his early 20s, a man about town. He was a keen biker, a real ale drinker, and he could very easily have left me to stew in the boarding house, but he didn't. So many weekends when I was 16 or 17 years old, he would arrive on his bike at the school with a spare helmet for me, and we would go to the bar at Tannenwood Hospital, where he had worked previously, so he could get in the bar. Where he would slip me a pint of real ale, of course, not really my choice, but his choice. Buy me a hot pie, and we would share some games on the fruit machine. We obviously lost, but it was still shared fun. I was very shy, very innocent in those days, and I was very grateful that he cared enough to rescue me. As I said, not all brothers would do this. I was also honoured that he let me into his circle of friends from time to time. Remember, he's in his early 20s, man about time, I'm a spotty teenager, okay, so imagine. There was, in the early days, there was Div and Jan. Div's real name was Matthew, who was a biking friend from the hospital. And then later on, Mike and Sylvia, who are here with us today, in London. And Phil Hawkins is also with us. I don't know Phil quite as well, but we have met before. I'd also like to mention Cliff and Kathy, who are very close friends of the same group, really, and who live in New Zealand now, as well as Axel in Germany. And I have some words from Kathy and Axel in a minute, well, in a few minutes. So all of these people were central and core to Chris's life. They were important to him, and also he was very important to them as well. But let's be clear, growing up as brothers, it wasn't all brotherly love. There was fierce competition as well. So back in the 80s, when I was in my early 20s, I played table tennis, ping pong, in a league, in a local league. I was okay, I wasn't a champion, but I was quite good. But Chris just played for fun. But every time we played, I always lost. And we knew before we started the game that he would win. And he knew I knew, and I knew he knew. And there's a pattern here that's going to emerge, I think. We also played chess as children, as teenagers. And Chris always won. Except, and if he was here with us now, he would know exactly what I'm going to say, and he would laugh and smile and wait for me to say it. And we'd swerve out it again. One time, one game of chess, I remember I put in checkmate with my bishop. I remember so well, we both remembered for life because we were both so surprised. It was the only time it happened and the only time it would ever happen. Again, this runs through his life to sports, and Mike and others who knew Chris, Axel also said something about this. He was a good runner, a good squash player, football, many other sports. And generally the pattern was, however hard his opponents tried, he would always win. So I'm quite proud of that chess game, because that's probably the only thing I ever won. Also, turning back to the family, when we were growing up, we played a lot of Monopoly. I don't know if it's a big thing, Monopoly. Everybody, so Dad and all 5 brothers played, and Mum was the only one who opted out, probably very sensible of her. And the family story is that one time when Chris was, I think, maybe 8 or 9 years old, he was playing a rather intense game of Monopoly at the end, trying to beat Dad. And he left the game and he went to his bedroom, and he came back with his toy pistol and he put it down beside him on the table, just as a warning of the consequences to anybody who dared to beat him in Monopoly. So this is a boy who, when he was asked what he wanted to be when he grew up, he said rich. And I think he was rich in family, in friends, and in having a meaningful job of work to do in his science, in his contribution to science. My final memory, other than reading other people's memories, is another side of Chris, his humanity from childhood, which I think you'll recognise, those of you who knew him very well. I think you probably all did. I think you'll recognise this from your own memories. When we were preteen, I was probably 8 years old, maybe. Nigel would be 5, maybe. Chris would be maybe 11, 12. We were in Malawi, in Africa, Central Africa, as children. And we went, as a family, we went on a trip to a game reserve in the north of Malawi. The house we stayed in had a small garden and then woods beyond that. And some days a small deer, an African deer called a duiker, quite small, would come out from the trees, hoping to be fed, I think, scraps of food at the kitchen door. And one day, Chris, Nigel and I were in the garden, and the duiker appeared out of the woods. It began to behave aggressively towards us, and it put its head down to charge. Chris's immediate reaction was to push me and Nigel behind him like this, so we were there behind him with his arms, to protect us. So as the deer charged, as it did, charges us at him, he couldn't protect himself because he wanted to keep us safe, and so he kept us safe. The deer butted his bare legs, I think several times, and drew blood. But throughout that, he stood his ground, protected us at his own expense. That was our big brother Chris. So now, I have short contributions from 3 people. First from Axel in Germany. Chris and I met in a lab in Liverpool in 1991. For both of us, it was our first day in the lab, and within minutes it became clear we both liked each other, even though we were very different people. I met Axel, they were very different people. Only a few times, and a few times was enough to know. In the course of time, Axel goes on, we became inseparable. One good friend called us brothers in soul. Whenever we telephoned or met, it was always as if we'd never been apart. In the lab, they always talked of Chris and Axel, or Axel and Chris. Those who love Chris love me as well. The only exception was Manu. Remember, these are not my words. Remember, the exception was Manu. who we both met at a party in London of Chris's friend Kathy, who now lives in New Zealand. Kathy invited both of us and Manu from Aloud in London. Within a few minutes, Chris and Manu were absorbed, and I was no longer important. I can only say well done to Manu and Chris. As much as Chris was a formidable friend, he couldn't lose the sport. For example, we both played squash. I had my modern, lightweight, carbon squash racket with me, which, when we first played together on the squash court, Chris came along with a well-worn, old, heavy wooden racket, and I thought, this will be easy to defeat him, or it'll be a catastrophe for me. The latter was the fact, when Chris thrashed him. Yet he said I never had the slightest chance of winning. The same holds true for playing darts. Chris was always a little better than my best darts. Nevertheless, he encouraged me to play the darts with him in the Liverpool pubs. I guess so he could just beat him every time. From Jonathan, who is a friend from a very long way back, a few words. I knew Chris for about 6 decades, from his family, when his family arrived in Malawi and became our neighbours. Chris was a quiet one, always in thought. In time, both our families returned to the UK, and later on we settled in Kent as close neighbours. Although we went our separate ways in school and in careers, and I would say in life, we also picked up where we left off when we met. We shared a passion for motorbikes. Chris had a new Honda 400 and I had my older Honda 550. We regularly went out for rides together, day or night when time permitted. Inevitably, the rides turned into a race, which Chris regularly won, resulting in much laughter and backslapping down him. Again, the pattern, he always won. He says, I once invited Chris to lunch and he arrived very early. The chicken for lunch hadn't thawed, so typically of Chris, he patiently held the chicken under cold running water for over an hour while it defrosted, and we had our lunch on time. Sadly, events separated us. He moved to Italy, I to Hungary. I miss his humour, his patience, his knowledge. I understand from those he worked with that he was greatly admired. At times he was an enigma of a man, but a man upon whom you could totally rely. And thirdly, from Kathy. You've heard Kathy mentioned a couple of times already. Kathy, to remind you, lives in New Zealand now. Chris has been such a true friend to many, but personally, I did count him as my closest friend, ever since he suggested I rent that tiny little box room from him and Mike in Garston, Watford. He never stinted or held back from sharing his whole self with those who were close, and he always wrested the maximum enjoyment from every situation he found himself in. It made people love being in his company, and he'll be sorely missed. Also for Kathy, a little more. I met Chris in my early 20s. Almost 40 years ago, I was very shy and totally unworldly, yet Chris found me and showed me how silly I was to lock myself away. There was a whole world to enjoy if I let myself. He has never failed me since, always showing by example how to grab the world by both hands and live. One of the most momentous memories I have is of his and Manu's announcement at Cliff and my wedding reception that they too will get married. They've become such a single unit that I can no longer think of Chris without Manu or vice versa. My heart goes out to you, Manu. You two are a shining light and always have a place with me. I will surely miss him and his wonderful rambling emails. Yes, I have those rambling emails as well. Life will be that much dimmer. And so, 1 second. Yes, 1 moment. I'd like to now share with you some old family film. It's just 5 minutes, not too long. Our father was a keen photographer, and throughout his life. And from the 1950s through our whole childhood, remember 5 boys over 10 years growing up in Africa, Australia, various places, he made film of all our family life. So I put together a selection that shows Chris in his early years as a baby and as a small boy. You might be able to see that he always had that cheeky grin, which I think must have helped him get away with all sorts of things in life.